Over the past 5 decades, this conference has served as a beacon for historians, researchers, and enthusiasts alike, offering a platform to explore and celebrate the diverse narratives that have shaped our nation's capital. From the halls of power to the streets of our neighborhoods, each story told here echoes the voices of those who have contributed to the vibrant mosaic of the city's past. As we commemorate this milestone anniversary, let us honor the legacies of those who came before us, while also reflecting on the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. Together, let us continue to uncover, preserve, and share the untold stories that make Washington, D.C. a symbol of resilience and hope. Thank you for joining us as we embark on this historic journey together. It is now my pleasure to introduce Lucy Murray, Letitia Wood Brown's daughter.
Thank you, Tiffany and DCPL, for hosting us again in this beautiful public building. I just told Tiffany, I continue to marvel at how this facility continues to have interesting and quality programming while inviting the public into its bright, beautiful spaces. I'm so glad to join you this evening for the 50th anniversary of the DC History Conference and the Letitia Woods Brown Lecture. I can't believe it's been going on for 5 decades, and remember when my mother, who was one of the original founders, and with others, came up with the idea of having a conference dedicated to the history of this city, and we're hoping it would last a while. I know she's beaming. It's a tribute to many organizations that have carried this mantle over the decades, including the Old Columbia Historical Society, Howard University, George Washington University, American University, and now the DC History Center, as well as the DC Public Library. Before it was named for my mother, after she died in 1976, the lecture was held in the Christian Hurech Mansion, which is now still located on New Hampshire Avenue. That's where the meetings of the Old Columbia Historical Society were held. But the main reason this conference has continued for 50 years is the tremendous support and interest of all of the DC residents who have shown up and supported it. If you all hadn't come to the sessions, participated in the planning, organized and shared your interests and experiences on panels, this conference could not have lasted this long. I think we all know what an honor and privilege it is to live in this city we love so much, and that has such a rich history of citizen involvement and activism and vibrant neighborhood life, thriving well beyond the walls of the Capitol, the White House, and the federal government. Rather than a lecture tonight, we're having a conversation. Van Newkirk is a senior editor at The Atlantic and the co-host and co-creator of a narrative podcast, Floodlines and Holy Week. He's covered voting rights and democracy and environmental justice with a focus on race and class and how they shape this country and the world's fundamental structures. He's a 2022 Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a 2020 James Beard Award finalist, and I'm sure he'll tell you about that because I asked him about that award, and a 2018 recipient of the American Society of Magazine Editors' Next Award. In 2021, he received a Peabody for Floodlines. Jerusalem Demsas is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she writes about institutional failure in democracy through stories on housing, infrastructure, and mobility. She is a visiting fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Economy and Society. Prior to The Atlantic, she was a writer at Vox, covering policy stories and co-host of the Politics and Policy podcast, The Weeds. In 2023, she received the American Society of Magazine Editors 2023 Next Award for Journalists Under 30. Will you help me please welcome Van Newkirk and Jerusalem Demsas.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Lucy, thank you, Tiffany, thank you to the entire family of Dr. Woods Brown for sharing this honor with me. Thank you to the DC History Center, to the DC Public Library, and to Humanities DC for tending to this event and making it an institution and 50 years is such a remarkable thing. Also, thank you all for dealing with me and having a conversation instead of a lecture. I recently, I've had a couple health issues that make standing and talking for long periods of time difficult. So, and also thank you, Jerusalem, for facilitating this conversation. But I do want to start with a bit of a statement. Just on the importance of history, on the importance of what you all do and what this conference does. So I am a transplant to the area, like many of us. I am from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. And, oh, we got some Carolina folks in the building? All right, all right. So y'all know that DC for us was the other end of the magnetic pole of the Great Migration, right? So I knew half my family had moved up to DC in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and we spent so many Christmases and holidays and vacations coming up to the city. Didn't really do a whole lot of super tourist stuff. I went to church. I went out to went out to eat with people, went to go visit folks in their homes. And so over the course of my life, DC gained this shine as a place where people from Rocky Mount went when you wanted to be able to watch a movie after 10 o'clock. After college, I followed that magnetism, following in the footsteps of elders in my family, of ancestors, moved here. I was 23 and had never been in a city with traffic cameras. I ate ramen and drank Pepsi for maybe 6 months straight because I had to pay $1,000 in tickets. Me too. But from the very moment that I changed my residency to DC, the importance of history in this place was evident. My father received his PhD in history at Howard University, and also another. And so I grew up in those rickety elevators in Moreland Spring Art Library. The stacks, yes. And understood even then that this place was special. And back then, of course, in the 90s, you could still see on street corners the relics of the '68 riots. You could see places that had been burned and had never been rebuilt. This is a place that wears history on its sleeve. And so when I came at the age of 23 as a young history nerd, who was deathly afraid of becoming my father, but steadily was, the place where I was able to access history in a way that I'd never had before was this very library. I worked at the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is just down the street, and the idea that I could come to a place that was free and learn about these figures that had been legends in my childhood, in my life, for free. They were just there. Sometimes they were even standing in the library there when I came in. And the fact that I could come off the street to a conference like this, it was something that was special. And for me, with an outsider's eye, I know a lot of you, this is probably you've come to this event several times. You've been in this library a lot. You maybe work here. And it might be easy for you to maybe take for granted just how special the living history of DC is as a place. And before we begin our conversation, I've got two kids. They were both born in George Washington Hospital. So one of the important things for me in my career, and the reason and the motivation that's led me to some of the work that we will discuss here, has been trying to add to and interpret and make use of that living history in the present for them, for all the other babies that were born in the hospitals in DC, so that this place will still be theirs in 20 and 30 years. And so that special things like this conference, like this library, like the people who come and share with themselves with us every day, that they will still be around and they will still help guide us in a future that is full of challenges. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, Van. And, I grew up in Maryland, and it's something amazing, the connection to local history that people have in this area. But growing up, a lot of our schools did not focus on this part of our history. And listening to your podcast, Holy Week, it really is a focus on DC's reaction to the death of Martin Luther King Jr. And I wanted to first ask you why you chose to tell this story, because, as a journalist and someone who has your platform, you have so much room to tell as many stories as you want. So why was this important?
So those of you who haven't listened to Holy Week, it is a podcast documentary about the week after Dr. King's assassination across America, but I focus on DC and on Memphis. And we go through that week with people who witnessed it, people who lost loved ones in the riots here in DC, people who were involved in politics and activism here in DC and in Memphis, and try to capture what I believe quintessential paradox of the story of the movement. We, at least in school for me, it was usually taught that the civil rights movement was an unambiguous victory, that we did the thing, we overcame, rah, rah, you can't complain anymore. And the fact that you can say that, and also most official sources date the end of that movement with an assassination, that has always left me with just a feeling that the whole story wasn't being told, or that the whole story was being told, just not by the people who get the most airtime. And that's been a vexation for me for a long time. If you came in and saw on the counter out there, we had copies of the King issue, which we put together on the 50th anniversary of that assassination in 2018. And one of the driving forces behind that issue was the misunderstanding of who Dr. King was as an activist, as a man, as a symbol also. And one of the things that was sort of left unresolved, and it's mentioned in my essay that I wrote for that issue, is the contradiction of the movement and the assassination and what follows. And I did not think that I completely did it with that essay. And so it's still been bugging me, especially now, as we look to an America that is banning books, where the history, even the not so radical history, is being marginalized, where it seems that even institutions that sort of were not really targets in the 60s or in the 50s are now being targeted, when you look at a time when HBCUs now are facing major funding shortfalls. To me, answering or figuring out the why of that paradox was worthy of taking a look for this podcast. I love history, but I don't do history or don't think about history as a journalist just because I love history. I want to try to tell a story that gives us tools for understanding the present. And I believe that when you look at the political picture where it is today, and you see all these things now that have become targets, when you see that the Fair Housing Act and its interpretations are under attack, when you see that the Civil Rights Act is under attack, when you see that the Voting Rights Act is under attack, I think what happened in that week in Black America and the reaction to that in white America, they both tell us a lot about where we are politically today.
And for those who haven't listened to the podcast, after the assassination, what happens in DC?
So DC might be the first of the conflagrations that we have come to call uprisings, that we called riots in many places in the 60s, or disturbances. Over more than 100 American cities in probably 30 minutes to an hour after the announcement of King's assassination, you had thousands of people in the streets in over 100 cities. And this was all obviously spontaneous. Most people that we talked to, they just heard Walter Cronkite and decided to get out there because they had to be out there. And in DC in particular, you had a year, and there are many historians in the room who've covered this year, a year full of things that, as Kwame Ture, as Stokely Carmichael would have said, they had primed the dynamite in DC. You still had intense housing and residential segregation. You still had some measure of school segregation. You had a year that was marked by police brutality and by a lot of the things that, if you looked at the news in 2020, would have been familiar to you. And the people in DC, there were already reports that warned that DC was a powder keg of Black political angst and activity, and that powder keg was lit in the hours after the assassination. So as the newspapers covered it, you had a locus of activity on U Street. You also had pretty much all of the historic Black neighborhoods in DC saw some type of unrest. You had pretty intense first night where there were people set fires, destroyed a lot of buildings along that corridor in U Street. The second night was, you also had people who'd come out. The second night, more youth came out from school and joined in the fray. And what I did in the podcast, if you take a listen, I wanted to.
And you should take a listen.
Yeah, maybe. I wanted to get a sense of a panoramic sense of just what that moment was like. If you were, if you were at Howard and walking out and trying to see what was going on, or if you were on U Street itself, or if you were in the White House. And this moment was it was filtered so differently by who you are and where you were. I think everybody I talked to who was on the streets in DC, they were primarily motivated by grief, by this inability to do anything with that grief other than be on the street. And just, a couple blocks away is how it's often portrayed. Inside the White House, the dominant attitude was fear. And those two poles pretty much defined how America reacted in that week.
And when I was listening to your podcast, I was thinking, of course, of the parallels it held to 2020 following the murder of George Floyd and the response in many cities across the country to that seemed like a very similar outpouring of grief and anger. And I guess I wonder, how do you see those two events as connected? How do you think about whether there were changes in the political context for Black Americans, but yet decades later, you see a very similar response?
Well, I should say that 2020 was maybe the final impetus for putting the show together. It had been around as an idea for a while, since 2018, and not just the uprisings after George Floyd's murder, but everything that happened politically in 2020. The fact that there was a pretty immediate reaction in many spaces to Black political activity and angst. Those were things that, to me, were, I think a lot of times in news, we love to obsess over what are sort of facial similarities between the present and the past. And I wanted to stress test the idea. Were there really similar forces at play? What were the differences between our time and 68? Where did history actually rhyme? And how did people who experienced both events see them or not see them as connected? So I think I'm always looking for a complication. And I think until 2020, I didn't quite have the proper complication through which to understand 68, if that makes sense.
You know, something that's really interesting to me is that there's a study done about the representation of people who turned out in the 2020 protests. And what they found is that the people who came out to protest were more representative of the American public than even the voting public in the 2020 presidential election. That's a very different story than what was happening in 68. What do you think that tells us about where the country is?
I think one day somebody's got to do a documentary about 2020. No, but really, that was a remarkable and I think seminal moment in American politics, American history, was the fact that you had people going out of all races, of a lot of different social strata, who were all on the streets together protesting and who were frustrated. And like you said, that is very different than the majority of the protest and riots in 68. But I think there are some connections between those protests, the makeup of those protests and the ones today. So in the podcast, one of the things that we focus on is Memphis. And Memphis, obviously, it's the site where Dr. King was assassinated. And one thing I did not know until we actually did the show was his body was laid out for the public to see in Memphis before it was moved to Atlanta for his funeral. And what happened in Memphis was there was violence on the streets in Memphis, but it was sort of muted the first couple days. People went out and made pilgrimages to King's body. People felt like they had to go do something, and so a lot of white people actually flew in to Memphis to just be on the street and try to join in this mass demonstration. And that became what was called the Silent March. So Ralph David Abernathy came back to Memphis and led a march that, to that point, probably was the most racially mixed demonstration for civil rights in American history. And so I think there is a parallel between that moment, between things like there were really mixed protests that were cracked down on in Kansas City, for example. And so I think there are strings between that actually predict the racial egalitarianism of the 2020 protests and riots.
And one complication that I think that you've been really good at drawing out is that there was not, I mean, there tends to be a sense of like monolithic opinion within the Black community, as if there's one thing everyone felt at any given moment in time. And I think with King, I think that's even more, seen in general writing and media, that it's just, this was a messianic figure. And what's interesting is to hear from people who experienced the assassination of King in real time, who themselves were like, I didn't really like the guy a lot beforehand. I was more radical than he was, or it didn't feel like he represented the way that I thought the civil rights movement should be going. And yet they participated in many parts, some of these people in the protests and in the riots, because they felt some, I guess, commonality. So how do you think about that? Why was there this outpouring, even from people who maybe didn't view King as the figure that lots of America sees him as today?
Well, there are two bad tendencies for portraying Black politics in media today. One is what you said, which is, the Black opinion, and you get your token who goes on a news show and tells you what Black people think, and sometimes people ask me to do that. So, but also I think there is an equally troublesome tendency to cast, say, Black power, radicalism, and the nonviolent movement as these two warring factions that never did anything, that were purely reacting to each other and could not get along, and all that. I think if you've had Thanksgiving in a Black family and gone to the table and eaten, you got a Black Panther over there, you got a Republican over there. There's a lot, the range of political thought, of philosophies, these are ranges within families and communities. They are not separate warring sides. They are a continuum of thought. People change their views. A lot of people who were originally in the nonviolent traditional portion of the movement, aligned with SCLC, they become more and more radical. But then conversely, there are people who began their activism career as more radicals who moved toward the nonviolent portion of the movement. And there were people, they went to church together. The reason why I focused on Stokely Carmichael so much in the show is he often is portrayed, and was portrayed in the time, as a counter king, right? As somebody who was the reaction, the young folks' reaction to King. He was meeting with King. King said that he saw him as a little brother that he disagreed with a lot, but as a little brother nonetheless. And when King was assassinated, the person who grieved the most on U Street was Stokely Carmichael. And so I wanted to tell that story, to show how, yes, these were differing philosophies of how we got free, but at the end of the day, they were people who were all trying to get free. And so I think you can't tell the story of how Black thought evolved if you have one of these two tendencies. You have to view them as people, again, we by definition, at least until 65, we had not been free in America. Nobody had done it. So these are people who were all trying out different ways to get the thing done. And they had some pretty nasty fights and came together also often. And I wanted to portray the complexities of how those thoughts and traditions developed.
And I think it's something that many people remember is that the Fair Housing Act is passed in the direct aftermath of King's assassination, and it's really interesting. So I cover housing, and I've kind of read the congressional record when they were debating this, and it speaks to the fear that you were talking about earlier. I mean, you have all of these opponents of the Fair Housing Act saying we can't let the mob outside dictate government policy, and it's like, oh, fair housing. And I wonder what you think, because I think often people talk about these riots as sort of being very unstrategic expressions of anger, which is true in many cases, but it also passed the last plank for of King's civil rights legislation. And so I wonder what you think about how that came about and its legacy today.
So traditionally, a lot of stories of the movement, the zenith of the movement, right, is you get that just remarkable period between 63 and 65, where you have the March on Washington, where you have the Civil Rights Act, where you have the Voting Rights Act. And that's usually, when you get to that point in the movie, you got about 15 minutes left, right? But the thing that King himself said was the most difficult part of the movement was this housing issue. And when you think about it, it sort of makes sense. So at least in the North, there was less of a fear about black folks voting. There were lots of people who resisted the imposition of federal oversight of businesses under the Civil Rights Act. But really, when the thing that strikes at the core of Northern segregation and of how individuals themselves were enforcing white supremacy in the 60s and before then, it was housing. And up until that point, American housing policy, and obviously you know this, had been constructed to basically make white suburban homeowners lords of their castles, right? They were able to exert remarkable amounts of policy pressure on the block level to keep who they wanted out. And going and challenging that thing was, in Chicago, it got King hit in the head with a rock. So I interviewed people who were in the White House at this time. I interviewed Lyndon B. Johnson's chief domestic policy advisor and a few aides. And what they said was this was probably for them the most fraught issue for them, the most fraught act that was passed. And it was something that maybe even because of the reaction to King in Chicago was considered for a long time to be a non-starter. So you had people who would come out and had been champions, white congressmen who had been champions of the VRA, who had gotten on board for the Civil Rights Act, who were not going anywhere near this housing bill. And that's kind of where the picture was. The bill was held up in Congress. We can argue about whether it would have passed with or without the riots in April in 68, but they certainly gave Johnson a window and a bit of a force to, and a moral moment, a moment to come and be the great society LBJ again, and a very, I think, thin, a very small path through which this could have been done. I think that had they waited a week, the attitudes in white America would have shifted enough to where we would not have had a Fair Housing Act. So it really was the reason why I wanted to focus on this week is there were so many monumental changes, including that one, that probably couldn't have happened anytime else.
And I want to give everyone a warning. We are going to take questions from the audience at the end. There will be runners with mics, so start thinking about them. But the Fair Housing Act's legacy, I think, is a really mixed bag because it purports to say that there's going to be no more discrimination on race, on class, on national origin, on color, and on religion, and it says that that will be upheld in both the private market and in public and government actions related to housing. That's not what the world looks like right now. So what happened between that passage of that act today, where of course we've seen advances in desegregation, but it's not the affirmatively furthering fair housing that is, in the text of the bill?
So one of the things that I was keen on doing with the podcast was showing how the really incredibly rapid shift in public opinion, meaning mostly white public opinion in America, changed the political ground in America. So you had people who had majority at some point supported the VRA, who were coming out and saying they were voting for Nixon because they wanted law and order in the streets. And Nixon, as we all know, becomes president on this wave of law and order sentiment. Nixon immediately decides, we're not doing the fair housing like that. He does what he can. He says he is against forced integration, which kind of, that's the, if you're against forced integration, you're against the bill. And so from the very start of the thing, he is working to sabotage it. They are minimizing its impact and enforcement in suburban areas. It doesn't receive the proper funding that was allocated by Congress. And in the immediate aftermath, basically the only, I would say, robust enforcement of it in that year and a couple years after were these DOJ secret shopper style investigations of bad landlords. Now, one of those happened to be Donald Trump, so, but that's being the main lever by which it was used kind of shaped how we saw what the FHA was.
I always, I think a lot about what you just said regarding how Nixon's election really undercut the Fair Housing Act. And there's a black professor at Princeton, I think at Berkeley now, Omar Wasso, who wrote this paper that's pretty famous now, which looked at counties that were next to riots that were violent and ones that were predominantly nonviolent, and found that if a county was near a violent protest, it shifted significantly towards voting for Nixon. And he theorizes that this may have actually pushed the election to Nixon. So how do you think about research like that in the context of, the response to King's death was in many ways what is called, a riot is the language of the unheard, and yet in many ways it may have redounded back on the very community that it was trying to speak for?
Well, I think this is a question that I thought one of the things that we could help understand about the present was just how much our geography has been shaped by 68. So I live in Prince George's County. And in 68, Prince George's County looked a lot different than it does now. At the border of the county where it met with DC, there were police snipers posted on buildings. For anybody who was going to spill over, they were going to shoot them. And obviously, as a lot of people in this room probably know, Prince George's County becomes one of the first sort of, in this game of dominoes where we play displacement in the city, black folks move out. PG County becomes one of the first locations where they move out. And you can still, though, you can see And if you have children in schools in Prince George's County, you can understand some of how this has all worked. You can see as the white tax base in a lot of these counties where they had this reaction left, you saw a major disinvestment in schools. You see in a lot of the, I think if you overlay counties that have gone from being majority white to majority black in that sort of geography of resentment about the riots, you see they've lost so much as far as tax base goes, as far as spending on education goes, as far as the basics of public, of what we even think of as the public. And you look at, again, I think DC is such a really good, it's a very good case study, but also you look at cities like Baltimore, you look at cities like Chicago, you look at all cities where you've had some measure of this inversion of black folks from inner city to inner ring suburbs, and they've all followed this geography. So it's sort of, like I said, it's a game of dominoes, because in '68, those places were white and pro-Nixon. And they were also beginning this last wave of white flight. So it's, you kind of get like, I'm trying to figure out the proper analogy or metaphor, but you kind of get screwed twice. So you get people who voted for Nixon because they wanted law and order, and then they move away from all the places they wanted law and order. So it's sort of it's interesting conundrum.
So at the time that the Fair Housing Act was being debated, there was a lot of, concerned writing from even within the Black intellectual community about what would happen in the long term when middle-income Black families could move away from the inner core. So what we see in Prince George's County and in the suburbs of DC and the suburbs of basically every major American city that has a significant Black population is that middle-class Black people are able to finally buy homes or rent homes in the suburbs. And individually, that's obviously great. They're able to go to where they want to live. They're able to live near jobs, because we see jobs suburbanizing at this time in the post-war era. But what ends up happening is the people who are left behind, what's often referred to as the truly disadvantaged, who cannot afford to live in the suburbs because the suburbs are more expensive, are separated from a lot of the community that was able to keep them afloat. And so how do you think about how the Black community looks today, how the Black community looks today, when there's been this sort of, now class segregation, as middle class and upper class Black families live in nice suburbs with good schools, or at least nicer suburbs, and in the inner city you see even more disinvestment, even more kind of depopulation?
One of the episodes, actually it's my favorite episode of Holy Week, we spend basically the entire episode going back into people's memories of Black DC, of what it was like in the 60s, of what it was like for people who had just come up from North Carolina, whose parents had. And while I think obviously there were intense amounts of concentrated poverty, of the kinds of police brutality that I was talking about earlier, but also there was a sense that this place is a community, that this is a place where I live, where my cousins live, where we go to church. I belong to this people in this place. It belongs to me. And one of the things we tried to show throughout the show also is the steady destabilization of that sense of belonging, of that sense of a thing belonging to you that happens. It's starting before '68, but it's accelerated greatly by '68. And so I think the main difference you see, and I grew up on the west side of Charlotte, like the idea that we were sort of part of a place wasn't really a thing. that this thing belonged to me definitely wasn't a thing. And I think, while allowing for nostalgia, obviously, that is the primary difference between how Black communities are constructed today. They aren't really communities. They are, even in the most concentrated poverty, in the neighborhoods with the most concentrated poverty, they don't have that sense of this belongs to me, because the reason why they're concentrated is because they've likely been displaced or are going to be displaced. So I think one thing now about Black poverty is that it is not rooted, is that as a black person, you have no thing that belongs to you now. And that's a big difference, a big shift. And it's something that I think we should really focus on as we think about what the Black community wants.
So we were talking about this right before, but I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of alternate history for us.
Okay.
So one thing that's really clear is that the death of King is extremely influential, that the world with him alive looks very different. But I feel like there's a lot of ways that could go. So what do you think happens if he's not assassinated or if he survives the shooting that day in '68? Where do things head with either the Fair Housing Act or with the trajectory of the civil rights movement? I know King, of course, was focused on the Poor People's March. So what do you think happens next?
Especially after doing the research, the interviews, and everything for the show, I came away slightly pessimistic about the idea that had he survived that assassination, that there wouldn't be others, wouldn't be other attempts, and also that had he survived, there wouldn't be a pretty extreme, acceleration of the effort from COINTELPRO to discredit and destroy.
Can you tell us what that is?
COINTELPRO, for those who don't know, it stands for the Counterintelligence Program, and it was a program run by the FBI to surveil and later openly sabotage the civil rights leaders of America. And they feared, if you've seen the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, they feared what they called a Black Messiah who could unite Black Americans against the federal government. And their primary candidate for such a Black Messiah was Dr. Martin Luther King. So if you look at COINTELPRO's evolving and continuing tactics in that era, they were not above open sabotage and even assassination. So you think about the atmosphere of peril that King was in. He knew it. And, there's sort of a tendency when you think about things like the mountaintop speech where he says, "I may not get there with you." There's a tendency to ascribe to that sort of supernatural quality. I think it was just a man looking at outside the window and understanding what America was, and knowing that all of his phones were tapped, that there were several plots to assassinate him, there were several people who wanted him dead. And so I think a lot about that, because there is I think, there's a bit of a temptation to want to say that if King had not been assassinated, we'd all be holding hands and skipping and going to school together. I think what the historical record says, and what King himself was realizing in 1968, was that we were at an inflection point, that America was already on the verge of rejecting the things that he was trying to fight for, of rejecting King himself. And I want to be clear-eyed about that, because I think obviously it would be better and more just and more humane if he had lived, if his brother had lived, if his mother had lived, if they had died old and happy and had been able to live their lives and not had to sacrifice so much in the first place. And I think it is a useful thought exercise to wonder what that world would look like. But where I come away on that is I don't know that at the point of the assassination, there was much to be changed. I think if you wanted to change that, you end Jim Crow before MLK was born.
So I want to thank Van Newkirk for this fantastic conversation. And before everyone get ready with your questions. There's going to be some folks with mics. I don't know where they are, but they will appear, I'm told. I have one question that I was instructed to ask you.
Yes.
So I guess you're an award-winning chef. You have a James Beard Award.
Well, I'm a James Beard finalist. And the best thing is they don't tell you what for on the plaque. So when we have arguments about where we are going to eat or what I am going to cook, I always say, well, only one of us is a James Beard Award finalist. As it happens, though, they have a very loose interpretation of what food and agricultural writing is. And in 2019, I wrote about black farmers who had their land stolen. And that feature was the finalist. But now it also has made me, I have been very focused on cooking, on improving the technique, because I can't have it on the wall and not be able to cook.
And wait, tell us a little bit more of the story, though. What's the story that won?
So that story,
Finalist.
It is black farmers in America. They lost over the last century something on the order of 98% of all the land that they owned. And I come from a farming family. I grew up feeding the hogs and raising the chickens. And one of the, I think if you have a black family from the South, you got stories of land loss. As stories in my family, there was always, it's just, somebody lost a farm, somebody lost land. But when I started digging into the data, most of that land loss happened between 1960 and 1970. It happened in the time when the story says we gained our rights, our freedom. And so I wanted to basically understand why that was, and I followed this just amazing family in Mississippi, where my mother's from, and the Scott family. They, typical story of just almost superhuman effort to claim the land, to build a thriving and profitable farm business. They got into catfish. They were the first black catfish in commercial farmers in Mississippi. And then the federal government started screwing with their loans. They end up losing it all. And I followed the story of the main farmer who lost the land. His daughter, she was working and had worked and had gotten thousands of the acres of land back. So it's my family liked it because I started the story. We are mostly food crop growers, so corn, melons, you name it. Mississippi was the very first time I had to, or had even been out in the fields when people were chopping cotton. That's a whole different type of work. And so my mom was from Mississippi, and they were like, okay, finally, you have lived.
Okay, well, we have a mic down here, I think. And if folks have questions, maybe, over here on the left.
Thank you. On this 56th anniversary, as the night falls, on the 56th anniversary of that epical epical day and night. Thank you for this inspiring conversation. I wondered if you might talk a little bit to the long, literally, road that leads up to Holy Week. And I'm thinking of the ceremonial and spiritual significance of the street in the District of Columbia for African American communities. One thinks of also the soundscape of the street, which has been so often there in funeral processions in the district from our earliest accounts. Of course, the sounds of wailing of slave couples, just right where we're standing. The sounds of struggle against pogroms from the Snow Riot onwards. But the street also is a site of self-fashioning and liberation, and everything that comes together in Holy Week, and then brings us to the street as the one place that's left, where it just might be yours when nothing else is, and then all the way to the street as a site of mourning that we have on 16th Street now, where Black Lives Matter Plaza becomes the street itself is permanently now memorialized as a site of mourning of all those lives who are no longer with us. So there's a long line, right, of the meaning of what the street is in this city, and I just love your thoughts on that. And thanks again for an amazing conversation.
Well, I feel like you should tell us. No, that is, I think, one of the things that was the most illuminating for me when interviewing folks about their experiences was this idea that the street, if there was nothing else, there was the street. And you had this, sort of construction of, the reason why when I first came here, I moved to Anacostia. And there's a reason why it felt so familiar to me, is you still had this sort of arrangement of porches and streets, of people looking out and being able to see the street, of people walking by and waving, and people walking by to be seen. And I think there's a sort of tradition there. Like you said, it goes back to plantations, to the Central Street and Plantation, where you had the promenades. And it's a tradition that is part of DC. It's a tradition that's part of New Orleans, of the Second Line. It's a famous song by Common, The Corner. It is the street, especially I think in the American context, when we have so often, we've broken up the commons, we've privatized so much. It is the main representation in a lot of our lives, in urban life at least, of public space, of our space. And so what we heard from so many people that we interviewed was really just stories on the street, of walking, of having, of carrying people's groceries, of being concerned about what is going to happen to their street, and of identifying based on that street. So thank you.
How about up here in the back?
Van, thank you for such a wonderful conversation, you both. I'm so glad that you mentioned Anacostia, because I wanted to throw a question at you that I very often get. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the linguistics department, and wrote a book about Ward 8 and about Anacostia and how it is one of these places that you said that there's not this sense of Black community in the same way, and that it is fractured so thoroughly. And that's actually one of the things that I've discovered about Ward 8 and Ward 7, is that this is sort of one of a lot of my interviewees called it the last bastion of Black community. And so people always ask me, okay, if this is the last one, how do we get it back? So do you think there is a way to reclaim those senses of Black community, those senses of Black place? Are we going to stay fractured after what has happened to the Fair Housing Act in the ensuing 50 years? What is your sense of where we're headed?
Well, I think there's always a way. I am Well, number one, I'm just, I think about the small ways, first and foremost, that people in Ward 8, in Anacostia, are moving to try and maintain a sense of community, and without which we wouldn't have it now anyway. So I think, the first thing that I moved in with my cousin who left North Carolina in, I want to say 1960, and came here and worked for the Metro her whole life. And Shirley Bryant, she passed away last year, and so I got to give her a shout out. She told me as soon as I moved in, and I could do whatever I wanted, but I was going to get down to the Anacostia Museum, and I was going to do the reading program on Saturdays. And so, I think people have the solution within themselves. The way that I think everything kind of comes back to this, the way that we put them in a place to put those solutions to work is we give them money, we give them places to stay, we give them reasons to stay. We give their children reasons and resources to stay. And I think that's true of pretty much all Black communities. That's the first step. If it's for your children economically rational to leave, that's the ball game. There's no other, that's it. And so I think we have to create and invest in anchors, in places that are going to be able to provide that economic scaffolding, or else I don't think you can even start the conversation. I wish I had the answer, because if I did, I would have a lot of money. But I don't.
Okay, how about here on the right? This gentleman's been very eager.
So I just have a statement in reference to what she just said. I'm from Washington, D.C. I currently have a business in Anacostia, and I invite you to come look at us and see us, because we're very together and collectively organized in Anacostia. I don't know if you guys remember Michelle Rhee, but it was Wards 7 and 8 that ran her ass up out of the school system. And in '96, when white folks in Ward 3 didn't want Black folks at the HBCU studying at the University of the District of Columbia, we stopped that, and we're still on Connecticut Avenue in a predominantly white area. So Ward 7 and 8, we do a lot. We just get stereotyped from afar. And no offense to you, but just come down with us and see what we're doing in Anacostia. We have Art to Go-Go that is booming. We have a lot of stuff that's going. So to hear, that from afar, that someone in Michigan or teaching in Michigan says that there is no collective organizing amongst Black people, I mean, that's just far from the mark, because we have organizations like ACC. But you mentioned about Prince George's County and the demographic in '68. A lot of folks don't understand, well, how did we get Larry Hogan's father as county executive? Well, that is because the demographic, as you had stated, was probably 51% Italian, white, and some other demographics, and then Black people moved over from the Southern Avenue line. But a lot of people don't know that demographic, like you said, was predominantly all white before it became a predominantly all Black county. But again, that is another collective organization of Black people banding together and electing folks in office that have been Black since or post Paris Glendenning. Sorry, that's all I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Van, do you want to respond before we take our last question here?
Sure thing. No, thank you. That's my response. Seriously, thank you.
So Van, I just want to say thank you first, but my question is, could you comment on 1968, or what folk that you spoke to about 1968, just what was happening, what was the vibe of 1968, how the country was changing anyway in 1968, everything from the music to fashion, culture was just changing, and how that affected, the rebellions after the King assassination, is there a direct, do you believe, or are you finding through conversations, is there a direct correlation to everything that was going on in 68 and then the King assassination and then what followed? So what are people saying about the vibe of 68?
So that's a great question. It's one of the things that we really wrestled with the most on the show, because there's sort of a chicken or the egg type situation here. Obviously, we are tracking, the cultural effects of this moment, but there are already things that are happening that are changing in America. As I think we said before, you did have the ascendancy of a black youth movement, of a more radical leftist movement in America generally. 68, we had the beginnings. We had the beginnings of SDS. We had in Chicago the protest riots, and that kind of kicked off a new era of American radicalism generally. And at the same time, on the West Coast, we have I would say, sort of establishment of the Black Panthers in the public eye. This is all happening in this movement space, and in trying to understand, in this space where people are trying to understand what comes next politically. You also, one of the things that we strove to do with the music of the show was to portray that culturally, musically, we were at this point of fracture. So, just a couple years before King died, John Coltrane died, which kind of announces that jazz, as our grandparents knew it, had given way in a sense. And at the end of his life, he was moving to a much more experimental space. We looked to folks like Pharoah Sanders, who played with him and picked it up as inspirations. We wanted to think about what this meant as far as fashion went, and as far as the vocabulary went. The sort of first real usages of the term black to refer to black folks, at least by white folks, started in response to movements that were happening to 68. So you've got, James Brown, as a legend has it, was sort of forced to make Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, as a response to how he was a more conciliatory presence in 68. So I think there's a whole lot going on in America already, where this youth-oriented movement is changing things, and we don't really know how they evolve and develop without this moment of rupture. But I would say there's a little bit of push and pull.
So we have an actual last question right up front here.
How you doing? Thank you again for being here and sharing your thoughts. I got a quick question for you. I heard Harry Belafonte say a while ago that he was in a meeting in, I think, around 1968 with Dr. King and others, and they were strategizing on the civil rights movement. Dr. King was real quiet, distant, to himself while everybody else was conversating and strategizing. And they finally got him to talk after asking him a few times, what's going on, what's on your mind? And I'm bringing this up based on your last question, which made me think about this. Dr. King said, I feel like we're integrating into a burning house, right? And I thought about that over the years, and what does that mean, in terms of the morality of the country? What did he think that his movement into integration was the wrong move, right? Should he alter it in some capacity, right? And then there's some theories, right, that if King and Malcolm X had both stayed alive, would they have come into a convergent path, right? I'd like to hear your thoughts on it in terms of theorizing on what might have occurred or what he might have been thinking, and what your thoughts may be on that.
So this is my opportunity to give a plug for a book, for King's last book, for Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. I think it is perhaps the most prescient and illuminating work about race in America to this day, and yet it doesn't really get the place of it's not counted up there with all of the highlights of King's life. But I think this book, the last book he was working on, and you can see all the things that were going on in his head as he was in these last few years. He is, and that's, the quote on the burning house is repeated in that book. He is ambivalent. I don't think he's ambivalent about the rightness of black folks having what white folks have. He's ambivalent about how the ground has shifted after they made that demand. So what's happening is, in 1967, when that book comes out, it's been 13 years of at least, I would say, in name, school desegregation in America. You've got places that do have nominally integrated schools. You don't have a whole lot of greatly increased outcomes for black students. You have a lot of white folks in communities now who have figured out ways to skirt those rulings. And so I think what he's trying to figure out this thing he called white backlash, which, as presented in the first half of the 60s nonviolent movement, we're focusing on the law, we're going to get the law changed, and we'll figure everything out after that, right? This was the figuring everything out after that. And what he'd come to realize, and what other scholars had come to realize, was that law in America is only as real, in lots of cases, as the majority in America makes it. And we kind of see. So King was trying to grapple with how do we change America under this dynamic? And I think that's just a good place to start to answer the question, but yeah.
All right, let's give one last round of applause for Van. And thank you all for coming out here tonight.
Thank you, Jerusalem.
How about before you two stand up, just one more round of applause. Thank you for Van and Jerusalem for such a wonderful conversation. Thank you both for coming. My name is Rebecca Lemos Otero. I'm the Executive Director of Humanities DC, and I want to welcome you to the 50th anniversary of the History Conference. I know you already have been, but I've been asked to do some final words, so I thought I'd start with that. So hello, curious people. Nice to see your faces. I just wanted to also thank The Atlantic for supplying copies of the December 23 issue of To Reconstruct the Nation and the King special issue. I'm guessing that's available. I also want to remind everyone that we have a reception upstairs. So please, if you have a little time, come upstairs and continue the conversation with us there, and let's chat a little together. And then also that registration starts tomorrow at 9:30 on the 4th floor. We hope to see you all there. And also, we'll be tabling tomorrow from 1:15 to 3:15 with a bunch of other wonderful people. So if you can't make it until the afternoon, come say hi. And then finally, you are welcome to come grab some coffee with the Downtown DC Bid on the 5th floor until 10:30. I don't know what the quality of the coffee will be, but I bet the conversation will be fantastic. Anyway, and the first session starts at 10:15. So other than that, thank you so much again for coming this evening. Thank you to you all for the fantastic questions and conversation, and see you upstairs.